When you look at the Midway-class aircraft carriers, you see two ships with very long careers, USS Midway and USS Coral Sea. Those two were heavily modernized and stuck around into the 1990s, and are, as a result, pretty well known, especially since many of their crewmen are still alive. On the other hand, the third member of the class is less well known, USS Franklin D. Roosevelt. This is not terribly surprising. While the other two lasted into the 90s, Roosevelt was decommissioned in 1977. This was very early by comparison. And in addition to that, she saw less combat service. This has led to Roosevelt falling through the cracks, as it were, despite having the notable legacy of being the first aircraft carrier named for a president. In any event, let's look at the story of USS Franklin D. Roosevelt. A story that began in the New York Naval Shipyard on December 1st, 1943, when a new aircraft carrier was laid down. Construction on this new ship would progress quickly. As a result, this new ship was launched on April 29th, 1945, not even 2 years after the keel was laid. The commissioning would come even faster on October 27th, 1945. Too late to join the Pacific War, of course, but still quite fast. This new ship was initially christened as USS Coral Sea. However, on May 8, 1945, that changed. President Truman approved a change to USS Franklin D. Roosevelt to honor his predecessor, who had recently passed away. With that done, the newly renamed Franklin D. Roosevelt, which I'll be shortening to just Roosevelt from here on, entered service. Let's look at what the Navy got out of her before we get into the meat of that topic. As a Midway-class carrier, Roosevelt was, pardon the pun, a midway point in American design. No treaty restrictions, but also not quite a supercarrier. A largely conventional design, but one that was quite large. As designed, the ship displaced around 45,000 tons on her standard loading, going up to around 60,000 at the full load. This allowed for a heavy weapon loadout. No fewer than 18 5-inch 54 caliber guns in single mounts along the hull, or 127mm for the metric viewers, along with 21 quad 40mm Bofors mounts for 84 barrels, and a further 28 twin 20mm cannon for 56 barrels. Now for the armor protection. That consisted of a 3.5-inch thick flight deck matched by a 2-inch thick hangar deck, and a 7.6-inch belt on the port side, with a 7-inch belt on the starboard side due to the added weight of the island's superstructure. Quite a hefty bit of armor for an aircraft carrier. However, this didn't harm Roosevelt on speed. The ship could manage 33 knots on 212,000 shaft horsepower through 4 shafts. And with that covered, that just leaves the air wing. As designed, this could reach up to 130 aircraft. As aircraft grew in size, however, this decreased to 80 or so at best, and more often 60 to 70 by the end of service. Either way, we've reached the end of the design. Now for the service history, which was the shortest and least eventful of the Midway class. As previously stated, this began on October 27, 1945. At least as far as commissioning was concerned, the ship wouldn't formally enter service until her shakedown cruise was completed. This would last until March of 1946, as Roosevelt sailed into the Caribbean and South Atlantic. Early into this cruise, an unfortunate incident almost occurred. On January 17, 1946, a Curtiss Helldiver crashed on takeoff. Roosevelt, being a massive ship, couldn't stop quickly enough. The carrier sailed right over the sinking bomber. Fortunately, both the pilot and gunner survived. A bit of a miracle, really, considering the situation. For its part, the rest of the shakedown was far less eventful. Roosevelt would visit Brazil in early February for the inauguration of their president, following which the carrier returned home. There were no notable incidents from February to March, rounding off the shakedown cruise. So, with little fanfare, Roosevelt properly joined the Navy, as 8th Fleet flagship no less. In this role, the ship would have a couple notable events. First, a fleet exercise off the East Coast in April and May. After this exercise concluded, Roosevelt would make history. On July 21, 1946, an experimental McDonnell XFD-1 Phantom landed aboard the carrier, and then took off without catapult assistance. Commander James Davidson's flight was the first proper test of jet aircraft on an American flat top. Not a bad distinction for either that pilot or USS Franklin D. Roosevelt. This was followed up by a Marine pilot testing a Lockheed P-80 aboard the ship in November 1946. Between those two tests, Roosevelt went on her first full deployment. The new carrier sailed to the Mediterranean from August 8th to October 4th, 1946. The voyage itself was largely uneventful, other than a show of support off Greece as the local government dealt with communist rebellions. Important, yes, but not as much as the next topic, because the more important aspect of this trip was President Truman using it as a political move, establishing a permanent American presence in the Mediterranean. This would later evolve into the 6th Fleet. For the moment, however, that would not include Roosevelt, although the carrier would spend much of her career in the Mediterranean. For now, the ship turned home, arriving back in New York City on October 27th, to participate in Navy Day celebrations. After those concluded, the ship returned to operations off the East Coast, during which Roosevelt would go in for a refit in July of 1947. The most notable part of this was the replacement of her 40mm Bofors with 43-inch guns and 20 twin mounts. When this was complete, the carrier went on to a quiet service life. First with her second Mediterranean voyage, September 13, 1948 to January 23, 1949. Nothing major of note happened in this period. The same largely held true for the next 5 years. From 1949 to 1954, it was mostly the usual peacetime work. While the country was at war in Korea, Roosevelt didn't see service there, although Roosevelt did participate in more experiments. For example, in February of 1950, the ship was used to test JATO, jet-assisted takeoff, with a Lockheed P-2. Other than this, the only major events were 2 large exercises. The first, Operation Mainbrace, came in September of 1952, the first major NATO exercise in the North Atlantic. This took place from September 14th to September 25th. The next event came in November 1952 with Exercise Longstep in the Mediterranean. This came after Roosevelt was reclassified as CVA-42 or Attack Carrier 42. Much like Mainbrace, this was a large exercise. It would, however, be her last big moment before the first rebuild. Roosevelt would visit the Mediterranean one more time from June 11th to December 3rd of 1953. At the conclusion of that tour, the ship was recalled back home for a major conversion. This was an adventure in its own right because Roosevelt was too wide for the Panama Canal. The ship had to round Cape Horn, which was probably not fun for the crew, considering the midways were notoriously rocky at the best of times. Either way, Roosevelt arrived in Bremerton on March 5th of 1954. This would see the ship decommissioned on April 23rd for her rebuild. The SCB-110 reconstruction, which Roosevelt received first out of her class. The most visually distinctive part of this was, of course, the new angled flight deck. This was angled out on the port side to better operate jet aircraft. It was matched with the fitting of 3 catapults, 1 on the new angled deck and 2 on the bow, although the bow pair were improved models replacing existing catapults. In theory, Roosevelt could launch aircraft from the bow and the angled deck, or launch and recover aircraft at the same time. That aside, this refit also changed up the elevators. The bow elevator was enlarged and strengthened to handle larger aircraft, while the aft elevator was removed entirely, replaced instead by an elevator on the starboard side, and a third one at the front of the angled deck. Not exactly the best positioning, but this was still an early stage of development. It was in the way of aircraft landing on or launching from the angled deck. The last visible change came with the fitting of an enclosed hurricane bow. A similar change was made on the Essex-class rebuilds. Past that, the ship also lost 8 of the 5-inch guns and the entire armor belt. Even with this, the weight of the modifications still added to the displacement. Standard tonnage rose to 51,000 tons, while the deep load came out to 63,400. Hull blisters were necessary to counteract this increase. Weaponry was reduced to 10 5-inch guns and 11 twin mounts for the 3-inch guns. Even this would be further reduced. By 1963, Roosevelt only had 4 5-inch guns and none of the 3-inch mounts. In the end, Roosevelt finished her reconstruction and recommissioned on April 6th of 1956. The ship returned to the Atlantic at this point and back to her old pattern. Atlantic and Mediterranean deployments, with the odd test in between. Although she did make a detour towards Antarctica, presumably while rounding Cape Horn, which probably helped with the testing. For example, in February 1957, she tested cold water operations, including the Regulus cruise missile. This went without issue. However, the same couldn't be said for later in the year. On June 19, 1957, the carrier suffered an issue in engineering. A feed pump in the number 1 pump room malfunctioned. Its turbine motor flew out, sending pieces through bulkheads, and bursting a high-pressure steam line. Roosevelt had to slow down to secure her boilers, and 2 of the crew, Bobby Hyder and Sidney Wall, were killed by the steam. 5 more were wounded. The ship didn't suffer major damage and was soon back in action. For a certain value of action, the carrier would help escort evacuations from Cuba in October of 1958. Beyond that, the rest of the 1950s was largely quiet, aside from a collision while refueling on October 4th, 1959. The 1960s would largely follow this pattern: refits, tests, and peacetime patrols. For the most part, the ship served in the Atlantic and Mediterranean, although there were moments of excitement to be sure. For example, patrolling off the Dominican Republic in November and December of 1961, because of political instability in that country. And then, in October 1963, she relieved USS Enterprise in the Mediterranean, and managed to win against the nuclear-powered carrier in an exercise, through launching aircraft, shutting down her electronic systems, and using the island of Corfu as cover. Actual combat, however, would be very limited. Roosevelt only served off Vietnam 1 time, from August 1966 to January 1967, 95 days on the line, which were about average for a Vietnam tour of duty, although her pilots did cause a major landslide at one point, and the ship herself suffered a fire in a storage compartment on November 4th of 1966. Not enough to take her off the line, but still notable. By the time the ship returned home, however, she was pretty worn out, to the point of suffering an engineering issue on the return home. This will also be relevant later on. For the moment, however, Roosevelt made it back home, where the ship once more took up her bouncing between Atlantic and Mediterranean. This would, in fact, be the pattern for the remainder of her service, with the exception of a second modernization that began in July of 1968. Before that, however, there was one more event of note. On February 6, 1968, USS Batch ran aground off Rhodes. Roosevelt would be one of the first ships to respond, providing divers and other support to the grounded destroyer. Unfortunately, the damage was too severe, and the ship was ultimately scrapped, at which point Roosevelt could turn home for that refit. USS Midway was undergoing her own massive rebuild during this time frame. However, that was becoming an equally massive money pit. Roosevelt would be denied a similar refit as a result. Instead, she would have the bow elevator moved ahead of the island, and various touch-ups to keep the ship operational. Notably, the angled deck remained the same, and she didn't get a rearranged port elevator. This modest rebuild completed on May 26th of 1969, at which point Roosevelt went back to her old duties. There wouldn't be much of note for the remainder of her service. One of the few notable incidents came in 1973 during the Yom Kippur War. Roosevelt would operate as a transit field for aircraft delivered to Israel. Beyond that, though, not much really. Roosevelt spent the 1970s on patrols in the Mediterranean, without much in the way of incident, aside from a storm off Bermuda in March 1974. The ship was returning home from one of her patrols at the time, and this storm battered in the number 1 hangar door and killed a member of the crew. After this, there were only 3 things of note. First, returning to the CV-42 designation on July 1st, 1975. Then a collision with a Liberian freighter on January 12, 1977. This damaged the ship's bow, but not much beyond that. And finally, Roosevelt would test out new AV-8 Harriers from June 1976 through to her decommissioning. Those planes would be tested aboard the carrier, which did have some useful results. Most importantly, how their exhaust damaged the flight deck. This gave ideas on operating the aircraft on other ships. However, by 1977, Roosevelt's time was coming to an end. The ship was, by this point, pretty worn out. One of her nicknames is Rusty Rosie for a good reason. The first of the Midways to be modernized, and only given a modest rebuild after that. While it's true that Coral Sea only received one modernization, that ship was newer to begin with. Not to mention her layout was better for the future than Roosevelt's earlier concept. Apparently, the ship also had structural issues. As the Navy saw no need to rebuild Roosevelt, her fate was sealed. The ship was decommissioned on October 1st, 1977. Efforts to save her as a museum would fail, and the Navy, leery of attempts to use Roosevelt to avoid paying for a modern carrier, would scrap her quickly. By May 3rd of 1978, she was in a scrapyard. Roosevelt did not have a particularly exciting career, but I think she's worth remembering for the firsts that she did have. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.